Alright, today's assignment we're going to be looking at how to use the TI Inspire calculator. In this particular assignment, I don't care if you watch every single minute of this video, but you need to use it as a reference, which means if you need to fast forward for sections you already know, go ahead and do that. If you need to rewatch sections to make sure it makes more sense, go ahead and do that. And if you need to use this as a reference during class to remind yourself how to do it, if I'm unavailable or if you can't find a friend that knows how to do it, you can use it as a reference then too. So keep this video handy because it will be helpful. So let's start with the Inspire. There is an on and off button. It's in the top right hand corner. If you need to turn it on, you just press it. To turn it off, you see right above on in blue, it says off. Anything in blue, you have to hit control first. You're going to hit control and then off and on, and that will shut it off. So hit control and on, and that's the off button. In the past, we've been using Scratchpad. Scratchpad is just a quick way to get stuff done, but most of the time we want to do something much more advanced than that, so we're not going to be using Scratchpad. On the right-hand side, you have things that say New Document, My Documents, even a Recent. These are all different places to save documents. When we're going to start, we're going to use a new document. If you already have started a document, that's when you would use My Documents, and I'll show you that in a minute. So you also need to know that up here in the center is a mouse. You can move your finger over it, and it will move your cursor up and down, left and right. You can also click on these corners, and this is an up and down, left and right mouse pad. The center is Enter, as well as down here is also Enter. So right now, we're going to click number 1, so you can either use your mouse pad to get over to number 1, or you can actually hit the number 1 over here. So I'm going to use my mouse pad, and I'm going to click number 1. If there's already something there, it's going to ask if you want to save the unsaved document. If it's not your document, hit no. In this case, that's what we're most likely going to do. And now it asks you, well, where do you want to start? If you know what you want to do, you can pick something. Generally, you probably want to calculate something, so you hit Add Calculator. If you want to graph something, you want to add graphs. And there's a geometry option that you might use a little bit in geometry. We're going to talk about the lists and spreadsheets and data and statistics a little bit later. And you can also add notes, or you can do, this is a function for science class. So let's click number 1, add a calculator. Again, you can use your mouse, or you can click the number 1. And we now have a calculator. So we can do things like 2 plus 3 and hit enter, and it says that the answer is 5. And one of the number 1 most important questions it's asking me is, if you do something like 7 divided by 3, and you hit enter, it's going to tell you that it's the fraction 7/3. This is a fine answer. 7 divided by 3 is the fraction 7/3. It's what's called an exact answer. When people are complaining about 7/3, what you're really saying is that you don't like it as an exact answer. You want a decimal approximation. Most of the times in math, we prefer the exact answer because it's a much better answer than the decimal approximation. But there are useful times when you want to know what the decimal is. So how do we change it? Do you see right above enter where the little 2 squiggly lines are? That symbol means approximate. So it's in blue, so you have to hit control and then enter, and it will take that 7/3 and it will give you the decimal approximation, which is 2.3 repeating. So again, 7/3 is our exact answer. 2.3 repeating is an approximate answer, which means it has a little error in it. Anytime you start with 2 exact numbers, calculator will default to exact answers. If one of these is a decimal, however, it will default to giving you a decimal answer. So we can trick the calculator by saying instead of 7, we can call it 7 point. 7.0 is the same number as 7. You don't even have to write the 0, and the calculator realizes that it's now a decimal, and we haven't changed the value. Then when we hit divide by 3, it's looking at 7 point divided by 3 and saying, oh, this is a decimal answer, even though it really is not. And when you hit enter, it will give you the decimal approximation. So you can trick the calculator if you would like to do that instead of using control enter. If you have additional questions on what you can do with basic functions, make sure you please ask in class or send me an email so that we can get those cleared up. Now I want to talk about a couple other things. If you see on the on button, there's also this little house. That's how you go back to the home screen. So if you click on the home screen, it will take you back where you started. To get back into it, if you hit number 1, you would create a brand new document. But let's say that you got here by mistake, or you got lost and you had to figure out where you are. If you click on number 2, My Documents, you could see Save Documents, But this one at the top, this unsaved document, that's the one we're already working on. So you just click on unsaved document and it will take you right back to where you were. So you don't have to start all over. If you don't want to have all this stuff and you actually want to start all over because you don't want to hit a bunch of delete, then just say don't save it and it'll start you all the way back from scratch once again. So next thing we got to do is we got to talk about today's lesson. Today's lesson has to deal with linear regression. So let's first talk about adding a new screen. So we're going to do an add, and we got 3 options. I'm going to show you all 3 options. The first one is you click on the Documents button, and you can go down to number 4, Insert, and then you can pick any of these. So you could add the calculator, the graphs, the geometry, the lists, the data. They're all sitting right there. But if you don't want to go through that, we have 2 shortcuts. Oh, anytime you want to get out of something, go ahead and hit escape, just like on a calculator. That gets you back out. One of the shortcuts is Control and then I for insert. And there's a list of the same things you can add. If you don't like Control I, you can also hit Control and then Documents, and it will give you this same one. So let me escape out so you can see it. If you get Control and you hit Documents, there's your same one. What we want to insert right now is a list and spreadsheet because we need to work in a spreadsheet. It should look like this. Now, if you look up here, I now have 3 different tabs open. 1.1 was our calculator. 1.2 is nothing and I don't need it. And 1.3 is our spreadsheet. So I want to get rid of 1.2. The way you do that is you hit Control and then up. Oops, there we go. No, Control, up. And it will show you all the different tabs you have open. If I, right now the 3rd one is highlighted. If I highlight the 2nd one by clicking on it, and then I hit delete, it deletes that tab. And if we want to go back to the highlighted tab, it's Control and then down. We'll take you back in there. So that's how you delete tabs. Now let's talk about this one because we're going to use it. This top line is the names we give it, and the second line is reserved for functions. We're not going to be using it right now. And then all the cells below, they're a slightly different color on my screen, is where you're going to put your data. So we need to go up to the top. You can either use the arrows to mouse up and down, or you can use this mouse pad, but you need to get up to the top, and we're going to name it something. For today, I'm going to name it X, and then we're going to tab over to B, and I'm going to name it Y. Now, you can name them anything you want. In the future, we might find reasons not to use X and Y. It might confuse the calculator. For today, it's going to work just fine, so we're going to call it X and Y. Just remember that whatever you name these up here is what you have to use, and the choice is really yours. You can pick any name you want. So here's X and here's Y. And then we're going to go down below. So here's number 1, and in number 1, we're going to add some numbers. Today, we're going to add the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I go over to column B, and we're going to do 1, 2, and this time I'm going to do 4, 5, 6. And I pick these numbers just so we don't have a perfectly straight line. So first thing I want to show you is what this looks like, and then we'll talk about our topics today. So let's say I want to plot these on a graph. We have what's called a stats menu. So we go to Documents, or let's actually use the insert one. So Control Documents or Control I. Oops, got to escape out of this. So Control I. And we want to add data and statistics. So we're going to add number 5, data and statistics. And notice I now have a new tab open. If I click back on 1.2, nothing's changed. So when you're on data and statistics, you have 2 axes. You have a y-axis and you have an x-axis. It defaults to nothing there. In this case, you do have to use the mouse pad to get down to these, and you're going to click on them, and you got to tell it what it is. Well, on the X, I want to use the X column, and you get this really cool thing, they move. But right now, it doesn't know what's on the Y column, so I have to go over to the Y column, and I have to tell it what I called Y. Now, I called mine X and Y. If you called it something else, use what you called it. And then it moves them, and it plots it for you. If you notice, we have a bunch of dots on a grid. This is called a scatter plot. So that's a vocab word. You need to know what a scatter plot is. It is just a graph that you have data points plotted on it. And it looks a lot like our discrete graphs that we were looking at before. So this is called a scatter plot. This one forms something very close to a straight line. If I was drawing a line that best represented this data, I would draw a straight line that starts in the upper left and goes to the top right through all this data. That is called a line of best fit. We call it a line of best fit because it's the line that best fits the data. And then we're going to have another thing that's called a correlation coefficient. A correlation coefficient is the number that represents how close all of these data points are to being on the line. The closer they are to the line, the better the correlation is. If you have perfect correlation, that means every single data point is on the line, you would have 100% correlation. We use the number 1 to represent 100% because that's the decimal for 100%. As you get less and less perfect, that percent will go down. So you'll have, say, like a 0.9, which would be 90%. By the time you get to a 0.5 or 50%, you will have a lot of dots that are off the line, and you can only barely see the line. So that's a very fuzzy, wide line. You could still kind of make it out, but it's not very good approximation. If you have nothing that looks like a line at all, it's completely blank, or just randomness dots everywhere, that's zero, a zero correlation. And we can do the same thing with negative slopes. This is a positive slope. From the bottom left to the top right, this is a positive slope. This would be correlation something close to 1. If we did the same thing with a negative slope, we would call it -1. The only difference between the positive correlation and the negative correlation is whether or not you have a positive slope or a negative slope. So you should be able to do all that. So this would be a positive slope. It's going to be something very close to 1, and we're going to find out in a minute what it actually is. Now let's go back to 1.2. You can either go ahead and use your mouse to click on 1.2, or if your mouse isn't working, you can hit Control, and then the left and right arrows will tab between them. So if I hit Control and then left, it tabs back to 1.2. So here's what we need to do. In one of these empty squares, not in the top 2 rows, one of the empty squares down below, I need you to have an empty square open and highlighted, and then you're going to click on Menu, and you're going to go on to Statistics. You're going to go over to Stat Calculations, and then we have several options here. In Algebra 1, we're going to do number 3 linear regression, mx plus b right now. And in second semester, we're going to use quadratic regression. But there's lots of other options here. Cubic regression, quartic regression, exponential regression, and there's even more down here, logarithmic regression. These are ones you're going to be using in Algebra 2. So make sure you know where this menu is, because this is not something that you just do right now and then you never have to use it again. We're going to be using this again and again and again in high school. So today I want you to click on linear regression, mx plus b, which is the equation of our lines. And now it's asking you, well, what did you call the x list and what did you call the y list? Well, we called the x list x. We called the y list y. Now to get between these tabs, you can either use the mouse to click on them. You can use the up and down arrows. Sometimes you can hit enter. And if all else fails, you can use this tab. Tab will go between the different ones. So if I hit tab, it just goes between them. We're going to leave the rest of these the way they are, but notice that this says F1 because we're going to come back and use the equation called F1 later. So get down to OK using one of those methods and hit OK, and it jumps in and it tells you all the information you need. So right here it tells you that M is 1.3 and B is -0.3. So if I need to write the linear regression equation, you can now write it. You write y equals 1.3 x minus 0.3 because it tells you what M and B are. So once again, you would actually write y equals 1.3x minus 0.3. So if I'm asking you what the equation is, you now have the equation. If we go down a little bit, we see what it says R, and it says 0.991241. R is your correlation coefficient. Again, it is done for you. So our correlation coefficient is 0.99, which would be 99%. That is very close to 1, so this is a very good approximation. Notice that our slope is 1.3, which is positive. Our correlation coefficient was also positive. These should always be the same sign. If our slope is positive, the correlation coefficient would be positive. So 2 of the 3 things you need to do are listed right here, your equation and your correlation coefficient. Now the next thing you need to do is you need to go ahead and predict the future in the book. In order to predict the future, you're going to have to use x, and you'll be given something for x, and what you get out of the equation, or y, is going to be what the future is. So we have 2 options. Let's say that we want to predict for the 10th year. We could plug in x is 10, and we would get 1.3 times 10 minus 0.3. but we have a trick. We don't actually have to type that in the calculator. If you go back over to 1.1, again, I'm going to click on it, or you can use tab and to the arrow to the left, go back to 1.1. I can just write F1, and then I want a left parenthesis, and I can tell it what to plug in for x. In this case, we said we're going to plug in 10 for x. So I put in 10 for x, close the parenthesis, and I hit enter, and it just did all that work for me. It said 12.7. So anytime I want to do that, I can. And just to show you for sure, it was 1.3. I could type in 1.3 times 10 minus 0.3 and hit enter, and I get exactly the same answer. All F1 parentheses 10 did means that I put 10 in here, and then I solved it. So you could do it either method. You can type all of this in the calculator and get it, or you could simply type F1 and then say what you want the calculator to put in for x in the first place. So this would be our predicted value for the future. So now that we got done what we have to do in class today, I want to show you some other neat things this thing can do. So let's go back to this 1.3 tab. We want the linear regression line, the line of best fit, to show up on here. So the way we do that is we go to Menu, we go to Analyze, and we go down to Regression, and we want a linear regression mx plus b. And if you do it, there's your line right there. And it has the equation 1.3x plus a negative, which is the same as minus 0.3. Same equation we just came up with. The only thing this is not showing you is your correlation coefficient. You still have to do that on the table, the spreadsheet. But if you just need the equation, there it is right there. So the last thing I want to show you, let's click back on 1.2, is let's say that I don't want to use the quick one. I want to go ahead and do an entire graph. So we're going to insert a graph. So again, we're going to go to Control I for insert. In this case, we're going to insert a graph. Now, there's some really interesting things that are going on here, so let's go through them one at a time. The first thing is you can plot your data points just like on that quick graph. If you go to Menu, you go to Graph Entry Edit, and you go down to number 5, Scatter Plot, and you hit Enter, it would graph your scatter plot. You first have to tell it what it's graphing. So it's the name of your first column, which in this case we named X, the name of your second column, which we named Y, and then you hit Enter, and it will graph your points for you. Now, you may or may not be able to see them because there may or may not be on the graph. So let's show you about zooming. Let's go back to Menu. We're going to do on Window Zoom. And we have all these zoom options. 3 and 4 are just like they are on your computer, where you zoom in and zoom out. They have the plus and minus. These are exactly the same. Zoom Standard will give you a window that runs from -10 to 10 on the X and -10 to 10 on the Y. And then some of the other ones that are important is down here. If you want to zoom data, it's going to go find all of the data points, and then it's going to go make a window around them. Zoom Fit does exactly the same thing, except it does it for function. So if you have a graph and you want to see where it is, you would try Zoom Fit. In this case, since we have data points, we're going to use Zoom Data. Go ahead and click Enter. And there, it made a window around our 5 data points that we have. Now again, we should have a line that goes right through it. So if we want to add that line, we're going to go back to Menu, and we're going to go to Graph Entry Edit. In this case, we're going to add a function. And do you remember that we called it F1? So I don't want F2, I want to hit that up arrow. And if I hit the up arrow, guess what? F1 has already been graphed for you. All you have to do is hit Enter, and it will go ahead and put the graph on this equation below. So go ahead and hit Enter, and there it is. Your graph has already been graphed for you, and it's labeled for you. Y equals 1.3x plus a negative 0.3, which is minus 0.3. And just like we looked at before, that line is right along where it's supposed to be in the middle of the dots. So there you have it. You now have several ways to look at the different problems. You can now look at the graph. You've now learned how to zoom. And you now know how to use your calculator. If you need to get out of it, you could always hit Escape, or you can always go back to the home page. Just to remind you, let's say I got here and I go, oh shoot, I didn't want to do that. You would click on My Documents, go to the unsaved document, and it will take you right back where you are. If you have questions, make sure you ask me in class, and don't forget to do the discussion post to get your credit by either asking a question if you still have any remaining questions, or just tell me something that you found neat or that you learned about the graphing calculator today.